All right, here we go. Good morning, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland, Shenzhen, just south of the Tropic of Cancer. I'm a little bit subdued this morning. It's before 5 o'clock in the morning because I am extremely pleased to have on the show today Mr. Joseph Essertier. How are you doing this morning, Joseph?
Very good. Thank you.
Just a really quick introduction. The reason Joseph and I found out about each other is he got involved in an email conversation between with Patrice Granville, the editor in chief of the Greenville Post, and a Japanese American artist in New York, Hiroku Hamada. Can you help me with the pronunciation of his name?
Hiroyuki?
Yeah, Hiroyuki it's Hamada, right? Was his last name?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Anyway, and it was just this fascinating conversation going on about Japan and Japan's history and Japan today and Japan, how much it's such a presence on the world stage, etc. And I thought, wow, this guy Joseph Essertier really knows his stuff. So I thought we should get you on the show and get a real Japan expert on the show. In fact, we're going to call this become a Japan expert with Joseph Essertier on China Rising Radio Sinoland. So Joseph, before we get started, let me go through your biography that you sent me
hmm
so that people know who you are.
Okay.
You're a California boy. I can tell you grew up in California,
That's right.
and Southern Torrance is in the L.A. area, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I lived near Torrance for a while, actually.
Okay, great. And he all of his schooling is involving Japanese literature, Japanese studies. He started his doctoral candidacy in modern Japanese literature at UCLA and
hmm
has lived and worked in Japan for God, how many years? Can,
It's about 20 years.
wow, 20 years. And he
hmm
is currently at the Center for Engineering Education at Nagoya Institute of Technology in Japan as an associate professor there. Nagoya is where in Japan?
Nagoya is a little closer to Kyoto than it is to Tokyo. It's the biggest city when you're taking it's the biggest stop on the Shinkansen uh, bullet train when if you're going between Kyoto and Tokyo.
Okay, all
So
right,
it's
great.
the fourth largest city in Japan, but a lot of people haven't heard of it.
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, I had just heard the word, and actually, I probably when I took the train from Tokyo to Kyoto, I could have waved to you if I'd have known you were there. You and
Next
it,
time, you could
good,
stop
next
by.
time, yeah, next time I will. I'll stop. We'll have a nice Japanese miso
Yeah,
soup together.
yeah.
He his this is a lengthy list of publications he's involved in, but he has written for the Asia Pacific Journal, which I've heard of. He has written for New Directions, which I've heard of. He has written for Counterpunch, which a lot of the China Rising Radio Sinoland fans out there have probably heard of, as well as ZNet, which I have consulted a few times, of course, as well as Counterpunch. And then what's really impressive is you're the Japan coordinator for the group World Beyond War.
hmm
Congratulations.
hmm
So
Yeah.
obviously you're a man who is committed to social justice and speaking
hmm
truth to power. I get World Beyond Wars email alerts. So anyway, we obviously have someone on the show who is eminently qualified to tell us about Japan and its place on the world stage today. So one of the things I always ask my guests is before they get started is you're the country coordinator for the World Beyond War, and you've written for Counterpunch and ZNet, and these are outfits that again speak truth to power, are against imperialism, Western imperialism, against war, etc. At what point in your life did you begin to see past all the propaganda of the Great Western, what I call behind the Great Western Firewall, and what I call the big lie, the big Western lie? I mean, was it like peeling an onion over a long period of time, or did you have like an epiphany, a sort of a come to Jesus moment, when it really, when all of a sudden you go, wow, this is it, and you finally figured out what was going on? How did it work for you?
Mostly, I guess you could say it was like peeling an onion. But later, one kind of come to Jesus moment I had was reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's just incredible.
Yeah, that was in college. But even as a child, I was learning about. I was in a kind of special environment, I think. So it was pretty gradual. My awakening to the fact that the United States had a kind of empire was already happening as a child, and then in college, my basic views of the role of capitalism and imperialism in geopolitics matured as I gained access to a wider range of reading materials.
Yeah.
And I started talking to adults more, got to know a guy who had been in the military, met refugees from U.S.-caused violence in Central America.
Oh, yeah. In Los Angeles, there's a million of them.
Yeah, it's easy to meet people in Los Angeles who people who've somehow survived, some of them walking all the way from El Salvador or Guatemala or Nicaragua, who have just had these horrific experiences. So that was talking to people, and then I had always read a lot of literature, and people like writers like John Steinbeck and George Orwell kind of challenged, their view of the world is not the same world of the world that you get on television.
Yeah.
And for many years, our family didn't have a television actually, so I turned to literature as a way of entertaining myself. And then I had friends who were passing around Chomsky's lectures.
Yeah. Noam
On
Chomsky.
cassette tape.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, amazing. Well, Torrance, California is not exactly Hollywood. I mean, that's. I always thought Torrance was like a really rough part of L.A. I mean, did you grow up with a silver spoon in your mouth, or did you grow up under duress?
I grew up under a little duress, I would say. Yeah. I grew up mostly in what I think of as a working class community, but it wasn't like Skid Row. We had a car, and we had central heating. Yeah, sometime in the 1970s, I think we got essential heating, and it's California, so it's not that cold anyway. And the schools were pretty good. This was in San Diego, California.
Okay.
I spent part of my childhood was in San Diego, and part of it was in Los Angeles. But and my parents were sort of like hippies, and they were definitely into marijuana there was they were young, they were going to wild parties and dragging me along.
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
that reminds me of John Hall. I had him on the show last year, and he was talking about that, and he was also talking about that. So having parents. And you forget about that. Well, there were hippies back then, and they did have kids,
Right.
and
That's right. Yeah, and so it wasn't a very stable environment. And a lot of people, including I remember my grandfather said he was surprised that I was growing up halfway normal. But I guess in some ways I wasn't. I was not not growing up normal, I think the fact that we didn't have a television and that there were just a lot of different people around, different cultures, and there was a lot of both ethnic diversity and class diversity in my family. My parents divorced, and my real father was my biological father, I guess you'd say, was very middle class, and my mother was very working class.
Okay.
So that throws you for a loop when you're hearing one thing. Probably a lot of middle class people are not aware of it, but their views of the world are often quite different from those of working class people.
Well, yeah, working class America. I mean, you saw sort of the blunt end of a capitalism, and the how cruel it can be and discriminatory against people who did not that did not grow up with like I said, a silver spoon in their mouth. So I'm sure you saw a unique view of the United States compared to others who were better off.
Yeah, Torrance is interesting because you can just get on your bicycle and ride 15 minutes and be in a pretty tough neighborhood,
Yeah.
as you mentioned. But now there's a lot of wealth in Torrance. So
Gentrification.
It's changed a lot.
Well, let's get into Japan. I know this is going to be hard for you to do because Japan has a millennial history going back thousands of years. But just if you can try to encapsulate, give us sort of a Japan 101 course. Probably most of our listeners out there do not know anything except they bombed Pearl Harbor and
Right.
Tried to take over the world in the 1980s economically and commercially. But can you give us just sort of a brief 101 course? I mean, I know that there was the period called the Edo period before Commodore Perry arrived. The American Commodore arrived in 1853 and used it. America's imperial gunboat diplomacy to subjugate the Japanese. It's a really fascinating and critical story, and when you tie all the loose ends together, it really did have a huge impact on 20th century and why Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. So please do that for us.
Okay. So it's written history goes back about 1,000 years, and as you know, the Chinese language, Chinese technology, culture, Buddhism, architecture, all these, there was a huge influence from China. But skipping all that history, Matthew Perry came to Japan and delivered an ultimatum: either you open up your country to trade with the U.S. or we will totally destroy you. And for around 200 years before this, Japan had enjoyed peace from the year 1600 until 1868 is the Edo period that you mentioned. And it was in spite of the fact that the country had been ruled by warlords and a class, or in my view, a caste of warriors called samurai. It was quite safe. Peaceful, and but Japan was relatively closed to the outside world. There was a little trade with Korea, Okinawa, which at that time was a separate kingdom, China, and with the Dutch. Portuguese missionaries had a small impact on intellectual, on, of course, on religious thinking, and but the shogunate, or it's called the bakufu in Japanese, the government led by the shogun, thoroughly persecuted and murdered Christian converts in large numbers. Foreign religion and thought were a big no-no. Buddhism had come to Japan, as I mentioned, and there was Buddhism was quite well established, and it was a major ideological force that helped to maintain the hierarchy, including a caste-like hierarchy, and discrimination against an outside group called the Burakumin, who were a lot like the Dalits or the untouchables of India, and there were various laws to prevent social mobility. So then Confucianism was another ideological force, as it was in China and Korea, and that undergirded family hierarchies, patriarchy.
Yeah, very much like China.
Yeah, obedience of the young towards their elders. And not everything in this political system would be unattractive to people today. Actually, for example, lords had to take care of their vassals. Peasants had the right to be fed during famines, even if sometimes it didn't. Even if the aristocracy and the local wealthy land, like provincial elites, even if they didn't fulfill their responsibilities toward the peasants, like during the great, what's called the Great Tempo Famine of the 1830s, police did not have the power to prevent angry peasants from roughing up, like beating up the village leaders, or breaking into the houses of rich people, which they would do from time to time. There were riots from time to time, and there were no guns for the police to use. There were no trains to deliver the police to put down rebellions. There was no telegraph or telephone system that would allow provincial rulers to call for help from a powerful central government. So it was not everything was we usually when people use the word feudalist, they say that Japan was feudalistic. People tend to not mention the positive. There were some positive features of feudalism.
Yeah.
You didn't have a lot of freedom. You had to have a passport if you wanted to go to what today you can just get in your car and drive 20 minutes. And that kind of that distance back in the Edo period would require you'd have to have papers, and you'd have to be have official permission to travel from one region into another region. So after Matthew Perry came, Japan.
Well, and that's why it was so easy for him, because they had no guns. They had outlawed guns, right?
They did. The populace didn't have guns,
Okay.
but down in Kyushu, they were, of course, since they came into contact with there was a town, Nagasaki, which people know from the bombing of Nagasaki, the atomic bombing. Nagasaki was a major, was one of the few places where foreigners were allowed to trade, and but in that part of Japan, down in Kyushu, they were coming into contact with, they were seeing ships from the West, and there were intellectuals were well informed about what was going on in the West. They knew that colonialism was underway, and so they were already starting to build cannons, and even though the shogunate in Edo, which is today is Tokyo, even though they didn't have permission, very often they were preparing for war to defend themselves. And Japan was pretty decentralized, by the way. So so each area had to sort of take matters into their own hands, and probably most areas of Japan were not really preparing for war. There were some parts of it were, and so and technology was relatively advanced. There were, engineers were learning, and scientists, Japanese scientists were trying to get in, all the information they could find, whatever they could get their hands on, finding out about what's going on and what kinds of artifacts or technological progress were being made. So there was a small but sizable number of people who were pretty sophisticated.
So what happened after Commodore Perry broke down the gates and forced the Japanese to start dealing with the United States? It's a pretty amazing story. I mean, it's the only country in the world outside of the West that heavily industrialized, like the United States and Europe and the United Kingdom. It's pretty fascinating. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Japanese were initially, they were forced to be humiliated with having their country forced open, and unfair terms of trade being dictated by Washington. And as you know, Western military strategists had been aware that colonizing Japan and China would not be easy. And fortunately, that was true, I think. Fortunately for Japan, its initial submission to Washington's dictates and its so-called modernization along Western lines sort of placated Washington for a while, and gave them time to gear up for industrialization. There was a successful and relatively non-violent transfer of power from warlords who had backed up the shogunate to warlords who supported the idea of returning power to the emperor away from the shogun, and building a centralized modern nation state.
Like a United Kingdom. It was steel mills and factories and all, shipbuilding and all that good stuff. Yeah.
Right. And
trains and telegraphs, as you were saying.
Right. And nationalism and newspapers, what Anderson, in his book Imagine Communities, he mentions, writes about what they call a print, I can't remember the word now. It's like a print mass culture that where everybody's reading the same language. They're reading and writing a national language, which builds up a community. But see, Japan's rulers first colonized Hokkaido and Okinawa, and then later Korea, Taiwan, and eventually they set their sights, as you know, on the big prize, China, and which was later the Second Sino-Japanese War, which led into World War II and the what we call the Pacific War. But yeah, the gunboat diplomacy and the open door policy was very much motivating U.S. Strategies. And Japan emerged into the modern world in the midst of some really intense imperialism. And Japanese knew that the world was a very dangerous place. By the time of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, you see the emergence of a full-fledged empire. So Japan is following in the footsteps of the West, and but now at this point is really safe from invasions and the immediate threat of being colonized. But unfortunately, Japanese rulers are not satisfied with just escaping the sad fate of China, and they greedily seek to acquire the kind of wealth and status of
the West.
Rulers of nation states, of the West.
They wanted to be a great power. They wanted to be a great power.
Yeah,
as they were called back then, the Western countries that exploited and raped and plundered Africa and the Americas and Asia and Southeast Asia. They wanted to do the same thing, right?
Right, and they made full use of their native system of patriarchy. Patriarchy was important because it allowed them to build up a massive labor force who worked in the silk industry, generating profits for the government, and that could be taxed, and that's one.
Joseph, are you there?
To successfully build a nation state. Yeah.
Okay. So unfortunately,
can you hear me?
you cut out just a little. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. So the women, many women were working in in the silk industry, and that generated profits for the rich country strong military campaign that the government was leading. And Japanese westernized in various ways. They sort of had to. They had to play up. They had to show that they were civilized in the eyes of the West, and along with that came ideas about racial hierarchies and
massacring Chinese and massacring Koreans, and you got it.
Yes,
the Germans did the same thing in what is now Namibia. They took over Southwest Africa, and to show they were like Japan. They were way behind the continental United States, the England and the rest of France, and they were way behind the others. And so they went in and massacred 90,000 people, local natives in Southwest Africa, just to prove that they were just as civilized as France and England and the United States in terms of genocide and massacres and extermination. So that was Western civilization, and I think you and I'd probably both agree it still is, unfortunately. But brings up a good question with all of the the fact that Japan became civilized, westernized by conquering and massacring people in Korea and Japan and Taiwan at that time, and an expansionist colonial empire. Before their adoption of Western civilized genocide, if we can say that, that's quite an oxymoron. Did the Japanese have their crusades and genocides and massacres and Spanish Inquisitions, or do you think it was more of an imperial disease?
The short answer is yes, it was an imperial disease. I like that expression. Japan had been a military society, and violence had definitely been glorified under the so-called way of the warrior, or Bushido. But the indiscriminate violence of modern warfare was something new. Japanese had not committed genocide against the native population at that point. Up in Hokkaido, there were people called the Ainu, and those people had been left pretty much to their own devices. But with modernization, Japan and the new central government in Tokyo started to colonize and incorporate Hokkaido within the new nation state, and so that entailed all kinds of horrible policies that are not very different from our Trail of Tears sort of approach to native people. So there was total destruction of their society and of the Ainu people's culture, and it was quite similar to what happened in the United States with native people.
And now you can go snow skiing in Hokkaido.
That's right. It's excellent skiing.
So well, let me just for those of you and some of the fans out there may know some of these and some of them, not some of them, but the Japanese, they committed terrible acts like the Nanjing massacre or the rape of Nanjing in the 1930s in China, and then in the 1930s they also had the Unit 731 and where they were literally doing vivisection, live human experiments on Chinese and Russians, killing tens of thousands of people and using biological weapons, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and then they had the Korean sex slaves during World War II. Tell us about the sex slaves. They're euphemistically called comfort women, but you told me in one of your emails that there were also Chinese and Japanese comfort women. I'm going to call them sex slaves because I think that's a more accurate description. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, that is a better description. Okay, I'll go back to this sex slaves. But first, about the the kind of violence that was being unleashed by the Japanese government, which was called at that time the Empire of Japan. Let's see, Japanese. The literate class was very aware of what had happened in India. And you can hear echoes of that in writings by people like Okakura Kakuzo, who wrote a book called The Ideals of the East. And this was one of the few books written by a Japanese intellectual that got attention in the West during that early period of Japanese modernization. Which is called the Meiji period, which goes from 1868 to 1912. In that book, he wrote prophetically that, and I'm quoting here, I've got a quote written down, "We have become so eager to identify ourselves with European civilization instead of Asiatic that our continental neighbors regard us as renegades, nay, even as an embodiment of the white disaster," what he calls the white disaster itself.
The white genocide.
But back to that's the general, to give you a rough picture. But back to the sex slaves. Yes, there's some explosive research that's been coming out recently in English for the first time, arguing that there were 200,000 Chinese sex slaves.
God almighty.
Yes. So
on top of already 200,000 known that were in Korea, right?
Mostly in Korea, but women were victimized in that way, and all throughout the colonies, the colonies that Japan had at that time. So even there's a famous Dutch woman who came out, was one of the early people to come out. But the Koreans were especially hard hit, and a large number of them came out in the 1990s and told their story, which, as you can imagine, in a we're in a society where patriarchy is very severe and there's Confucianism. The shame associated with that, and the way that women are who can be ostracized.
It was very courageous of them,
anyway,
wasn't it?
Right, and so then this book I mentioned that's written about the Chinese sex slaves is entitled "The Chinese Comfort Women," and it's by a woman named Pei Pei Chu. That's Qiu. But the numbers continue to rise as time goes on. More and more women are inspired by the brave souls that have come before them and that have spoken out. And much of the research, as in the Chinese case, is often published in other languages first, and then it has to be translated into English. So there's a little time lag. But one of the most interesting books that I've read on this topic, the most interesting book that I've read, and I haven't read that much actually. I've only been reading and really getting into this topic in the last few years. But the one that I would highly recommend to other people is called "The Japanese Comfort Women and Sexual Slavery During the China and Pacific Wars," and that's by Carolyn Norma. And she argues that there was a big sex trafficking industry in Japan in the 1920s that had developed under a civilian government, and that the government adopted that pre-made system to fulfill the military's purposes. Mm-hmm. The actual goal, according to another historian named Yoshimi Yoshiaki, he has written that, or he explains that the actual goal for the military was less to prevent the spread of disease or to reduce the number of random rapes by soldiers of the enemy population, than to prevent insurrection inside the military.
Yeah.
So I was a kind of reward or way of placating Japanese soldiers, and you have to understand this is where Norma Carolyn comes in. She explains that even back in the 1920s, it was already a recognized male entitlement for men to. It was expected that men could go to prostitutes when they wanted to. It was they had a right to that. So this was. So it was just what happened in the wartime period was just a continuation of a system of sex trafficking that Japan already had, according to her.
Well, go ahead, Joseph. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that so that we don't. What I hope will happen is that as we learn more about the Japanese system of sex slavery, military sex slavery, we will start to think more and more about sex trafficking in general, and about the way that what the U.S. government does in terms of twisting the arms of weaker countries like South Korea and the Philippines to keep the sex trafficking industry going, so they can supply their soldiers with incarcerated and trapped women. That's all I want.
Well, as I have written more than once, every day, and especially for Western Empire. But this is, if you're occupied by Americans or Europeans, but this is true for all war. Every day is a My Lai. I mean, it's just, rape, plunder, massacres, extermination. I mean, this is war, and this is especially imperial war. And so it's very, very disturbing. There's a what's really fascinating is that there is a massive, Japanese ultranationalist denial industry that completely
Yes.
that wants to completely whitewash all of this from the history books. But at the same time, the same thing is going on in the United States and Europe. There is a complete and total denial of the West's, Dalrymple Paul, the great Indian historian. I've also written about this in the last two books of the China trilogy. He did census figures and did a lot of studying, and he estimated that over the 300 years of Indian of British tyranny in the Indian subcontinent, that they shortened the lives of no fewer than 500 million dark-skinned people, and it could be as high as 1.5 billion. So I very well, but think about it. Over 300 years, 500 million. It's only 3 million a year. And when you look
Okay.
at the Bengal famine, 5 to 8 million were massacred there. And so I always just say, that the West easily, exterminated 1 billion people in during its 500 year of colonial reign, which is still going on in Syria and Libya and but anyway, so we deny the extermination of 15 to 18 million Native Americans. The Canadians deny it. The Australians sweep it under the rug. The New Zealanders sweep it under the rug. The Europe sweeps it under the rug, and so and the Japanese are doing it. So tell us about the Japanese.
Okay. Japanese denialism. The Japanese government right now is riddled with Japanese ultranationalists, and no wonder that Koreans and Chinese and women's rights activists worry about this. And so the question is, why is there so much denialism in Japan? Besides the fact that Japanese receive a very poor history education, like Americans, very few of them hold their officials to account, and a number of elite officials, starting at the top with people like Shinzo Abe, the prime minister, and the deputy prime minister Taro Aso, have ancestors who were like grandparents or grandparents who were guilty of directing atrocities such as the comfort women system. Taro Aso is the heir to a mining fortune that was built up by exploiting Korean forced laborers, in other words, slaves, during the war. This relates to our government's actually reverse course, where these ultranationalists were let out of prison. There was one A-class criminal named Kishi Nobusuke, who was Prime Minister Abe's grandfather, and he actually became the Prime Minister of Japan.
So a war criminal after World War II, a Class A, which would basically be like a Himmler or a Goebbels, was actually released from prison and became Prime Minister of Japan.
That's right, and he ran the show for three years.
And that is Shinzo Abe, the current Prime Minister's grandfather.
Right.
Unbelievable.
So and Taro Aso, as I mentioned, he's the heir to a mining fortune that was
basically
set up
Korean
by
slaves
in Manchuria.
Yeah, Korean slaves
In Manchuria. Yeah.
Unbelievable. And then again, and when you mention, the extermination of America's Native Americans, people's eyes just roll. Americans just kind of go, oh, past, what's on TV tonight,
Yeah.
pass me the French fries. There's just a complete disconnection between our horrific past, and not just in North America, but the Philippines and Cuba and Latin America. I just read a startling statistic that by it was like the early 1900s, the United States had committed 6,000 military incursions in Latin America from the time of the
Wow.
Philippines, 1898, up until I think it was World War II. 6,000. And
Wow.
anyway, it's just really amazing. It's like sort of like, well, even Teddy Roosevelt, who fell all over the Japanese and basically gave them carte blanche to invade and colonize Taiwan and Korea, and thought they would stop in Manchuria. Ha 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 ha. He actually called them honorary Aryans. I mean, he thought they were the white race of of Asia, and that they were going to, be America's, good little poodle, and fetch and sit, when the Americans, told them to, and obviously it didn't turn out that way. Empire is relentless in its pursuit of resources and plunder.
Yes.
Tell us quickly. I even wrote an article about this. I think it's in China. Yeah, it's in book number 2, China Rising, about Okinawa. You said it was an independent country until fairly recently. That's where most of America's 50,000 troops are in Japan, and if you get a map out and look at what the United States occupies in Okinawa, it's like 1/3 of the entire island. And there's I don't know how many people there are there, but I think there's like 30,000 or 40,000 Americans there, I mean, it is literally a militarily occupied, place.
Yeah.
Just tell us about the brave mayor there. I mean, I've seen footage of he and his people, trying to get the Americans to leave, which will never happen, especially with Shinzo Abe.
I don't know so much. Okay.
Go ahead.
I don't know so much specifically about the mayor, but there have been a number of mayors and governors over the years, because Okinawa is a prefecture, and it's also then there's like Nago City, which is actually that there the mayor lost the struggle for against the bases, lost a lot of momentum because in the recent election in Nago City, the anti-base candidate lost. But there have been a number of government officials leading Okinawa who were with the people, because they have a very strong, I would say, strong democratic movements fighting for the rights of the citizens. They're unlike in many other parts of Japan. But let's see. So you wanted me to talk about the anti-war movement?
Yeah.
in
Just
Okinawa,
that that there also is a strong anti-war movement, anti-atomic weapons movement. Japan is not a total. I mean, even though it's an occupied country, I think I've heard upwards to like 90 military installations. 50,000 soldiers in a country the size of California. I mean, just imagine.
Yeah.
Imagine 50,000 Chinese soldiers, PLA soldiers in California, and that's what it's like. It's just
Yeah,
hard to imagine.
it's very hard for Americans to imagine because we've never been occupied. But yeah, so most of the best land of Okinawa is taken up by military bases, and there's violence, all kinds of violence, including sexual violence around the bases, and the very often the soldiers who commit these acts of violence are not prosecuted. So there's no justice, there's no sense of closure, and there are all of these Okinawan people who have had these traumatic experiences. It's noisy, horrible noise pollution. We're talking like 100 decibels very often for people who are near the bases. And some of the bases are built right next to cities. Cities have built up around of course, the bases have been a source of jobs for many people, and so their various services have built up to meeting the needs of soldiers. But so there's a lot of people living around the bases, and one of the issues that I have written or been focusing on recently with Okinawa is again the sexual violence and sex trafficking. And there's a scholar named Catherine Moon, who's a political scientist, and she's one of the few people who've really looked into this for South Korea, and she has a broad perspective about what's going on around the world. But you find that with respect to South Korea and Okinawa, when you read what she's written, that there is some progress that's being made in South Korea and the United States with the U.S. military disciplining its soldiers more and more. But there's been constant, for several decades since the end of the Pacific War, there's been constant sexual violence against women who happen to be just walking down the street or who happen to live near bases, and that's been a big source of protests, of anti-base sentiment in Okinawa. There was a case, a guy named Shinzato, I guess he took his Japanese wife's name, and he raped and murdered a 20-year-old woman who was an office worker.
I read about that. I remember that. Yeah.
You've heard about that?
Yeah.
So that kind of thing just has been happening. It just continues to happen, and that really tends to. That's just one type of. There's also murders of other citizens, and so those kinds of things gradually cause an explosion where the ordinary citizens just get really sick of it, and they just say, okay, well, let's just get rid of these bases. And fortunately for Okinawa, they've got a lot of the tourism industry as a big source of income, so they're not as dependent on the military for basic, their basic needs, or that influx. They don't need that influx of money from the bases that they used to, and so the movement is quite strong in spite of the fact that this recent loss during in the Nago city election.
That surprises me. Well, one thing I've learned among many things, and thank you, Joseph, for all of your amazing knowledge, is that the sex trafficking, the massive sex trafficking industry in Asia is being propelled by U.S. military occupation of South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, even Australia has got 1,500 soldiers and atomic bombers and it just goes on and on and on all throughout Asia, and so it does not surprise me that the presence of the U.S. military in Asia would be driving sex slave trafficking. So even today in the 21st century. Well, listen, Joseph, this has been an amazing introduction to China. Before we head out, can you just tell us where, you're obviously very knowledgeable. Can you just tell us 3 or 4 of your favorite websites that you consult, and I'll put all these on in the article on the for our interview.
For information about war and peace issues, and especially analysis of what's going on, I use the Asia Pacific Journal, Japan Focus, a lot. So you can get some very short, well-written articles by researchers on a lot of different war-related issues there. For everyday news, the Japan Times is not bad. They've had a number of writers who are quite progressive and who have a broad perspective and well informed about Japan, the Japanese remilitarization, as well as the bases that we just talked about.
And that's in English, right? The Japan Times is in English. Okay. All right.
Yeah, these are all in English. And for news about Korea, I use Hankyorei and what's called NK News. That's NK is for North Korea. So information on North Korea, there's an excellent website.
I'll ask you to send me all these links, and then I'll put these in the article.
Okay, and then Ryukyu Shimpo is a really good source of information on what's happening in Okinawa. So unlike the Japan Times does cover Okinawa to an extent, but you don't get there are a lot of really important stories that don't get covered in the Japan Times, whereas Ryukyu Shimpo is very thorough, and they talk about the anti-base movement in Okinawa a lot. So those are some good sources.
I will put on I'll put on Chu Peipei's book, The Chinese Comfort Women, and I'll also put on Caroline Norma's book, the link. And you mentioned Catherine Moon. I'll ask you to help me get the links to all those 3 books about sex slavery in Japan. And what are some books other books just about China, about Japan, that instead of the standard whitewashed version, Western version, they came, they bombed us, and are there some good books that you like?
Besides the authors I've already mentioned, I would highly recommend John Dower's book War Without Mercy.
Okay.
And Herbert Bix's book entitled Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan. From those books, you can get a good sense of what these imperialistic wars have meant for Japanese, and also you get a hint of what was done to people in the colonies. I'll have to get you on for Korea, for what happened to Koreans from a Korean or seeing the world, I guess, from the perspective of Koreans, and just basic history that Americans don't know. I would really recommend Bruce Cummings' book, The Korean War, History.
Everybody's recommending that to me. It's just I'm going to have to get it, and I'll put the link on for that.
Bruce Cummings has lots of articles too on the internet.
All right. I know in our email trafficking going back and forth. I read the entire trilogy of Chalmers Johnson, and he lived and worked in Japan. And I know you have some bones to pick with the guy, but he also, I think, did presents, well, just the whole America, the whole global empire, just how it's just been a disaster from the very beginning. But I know he
Yeah.
lived there for a long time, and has a huge sections of those three books also cover Japan. So,
Yeah.
well, let's go ahead.
You want me to talk about that a little, or?
Yeah. Quickly, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. Washington shared a lot of technology with Japan and South Korea to get their economies going, which was one of the things that he emphasizes, just as what happened with Germany. And it was decided, as many people know, that Germany and Japan would become the workshops of the world. And this worked very well in the case of Japan and Germany. And the economy in Japan really started taking off in the 1950s. And then just really from between the 1950s and 1970s, Japan experienced the greatest improvement in standard of living of any country in the world. And MacArthur's reforms had actually liberalized Japan in various ways. One of these was labor laws, and another was land reform, where ownership of land was actually transferred from rich landowners to poor tenant farmers.
That's
So there was a
amazing.
big
And just like in China, there was actually land redistribution from the rich to the poor. That's amazing. I didn't know
Right.
that.
And so that's something that doesn't, yeah, so that capitalism gets the credit for all these wonderful things that happened to Japan. But Chalmers Johnson, really, one of his achievements was actually, I think, challenging neoliberalism way back in 1982 with his book Miti and the Japanese Miracle. He demonstrated that Japanese bureaucrats in the central government had actually planned the economy, controlled it, and regulated it, and done the exact opposite of what countries were expected to do under IMF and World Bank style policies.
Yeah. That's amazing. All right, well, good.
Yeah.
So Japan in the early days was a closet socialist country.
Right. Right. And many economists were Marxists.
That's
Yeah.
That's incredible. Oh, amazing.
Yeah, and so I'm surprised when Japan seems very conservative, but you meet people in academia too. There were a lot of, now these older scholars are starting to retire and move on, but there have been a lot of Marxist economists and left-wing sorts of intellectuals in academia in Japan. So, in
And they
spite
seem
of
to have had an impact on the economic policy too.
yeah, a lot of them, MacArthur coming in the immediate post-war period, coming in and taking out all these ultranationalists from the government, sort of opened up a space for people who they probably were. I imagine they were like closet, they were secretly reading books of
Closet communists.
yeah, and going from a range, from the left to liberal spectrum, just reading all kinds of different books, and they were,
Amazing.
and they had dreams. They had other dreams for Japan. They didn't necessarily want to continue to have these insane, total wars, building empires. Some of them wanted just, they actually cared about the people that they were working for.
Wow. Well, listen, Joseph, this has been an amazing interview. I really am glad to have you on. I've never had anybody on the show, and I've been doing this for a number of years, that could even begin to talk about Japan the way you have today. And I think the title of this, Become a China Expert with Joseph Essertier, is very apropos. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. This was interesting.
and please send me all these links to the. I'm going to have to ask you to work a little bit more before we sign, after we sign out, and just send me
Hmm.
all the links to these books and newspapers and websites and stuff.
Okay.
This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland in Shenzhen. I've just had on Joseph Essertier, a Japanese expert who has lived in Japan for over 20 years and obviously knows the language fluently and knows the country and has and like me is anti-empire, anti-war, and so really glad to have you on, Joseph, and thanks for getting up maybe a little earlier than normal and being with us today on China Rising Radio Sinoland.
Not at all. Thank you.
All right, we'll talk to you later, Joseph. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye.